the microphones there. Look, the Slido thing will be working, so please do throw in some questions, and in a few minutes I'll pick up the iPad and start seeing what you want to ask from the floor. But funnily enough, I've had a few I've prepared earlier. And look, the first question I'd like to ask, I think it's, we've got this whole session really around private sector finance. And I think often we find people say, why? Why should we, isn't it? Surely government can borrow cheaper. Why would you want to have private capital come into government infrastructure? So I'd like to just direct that in the first place perhaps to Hugh and to Stephen Proctor. So Hugh, you've advised government on pretty much every government PPP. So I think you're in a great position to reflect on the thinking in government. And Stephen, you funded most of them here in New Zealand. So similarly, you can tell us what it is that the private capital brings. So perhaps Hugh, if you'd like to go first.
Thank you, Grant, and particularly for asking the only person here without any money. So what does private capital bring to the table? Well, I think, New Zealand has started on the PPP journey quite differently than other jurisdictions. Its focus hasn't been on the direct financial impact of private capital as the only factor for doing PPPs. It's ultimately been in the delivery of better public services via the introduction of private sector expertise, and the capital is only part of that. It holds the contractors to account. It provides rigour in the due diligence process for projects which just simply isn't provided within solely publicly funded projects. So I might hand over to Stephen to give his own view on this.
Thanks, Hugh. So I think there's two reasons. There's sort of like a prosaic answer, and then there's kind of what the real answer is. So the first one, the kind of the glib prosaic answer, is that if you pay for a thing straight away, it's very hard if that thing doesn't work to kind of get your money back. So the reason that financing is useful in the provision of infrastructure is that you've delayed or deferred payment for it, and if it fails, then you can stop paying for it, I guess. But actually, I think for New Zealand, the answer is a different one, which is that New Zealand is an out-of-the-way place. So it takes a lot of effort for new ideas to come to New Zealand and for people to find new ideas that are relevant for New Zealand. And the rest of the world faces challenges that New Zealand face around the provision of infrastructure, better buildings, all sorts of just human challenges. And different people in different parts of the world will have come upon those challenges and decided to fix them and address them in different ways. And some of those ways of addressing those challenges and problems will be wrong-headed, and they will result in a failure. But some of them won't be. Some of them will be magnificent, and they will be excellent ways of fixing that problem that we will share, because we're human beings too. And the question is, how do you, as quickly and efficiently as possible, bring the winning ideas, the good ideas, to New Zealand? And the way that you do that is by plugging New Zealand into a global marketplace. And that is what money is. So if New Zealand chooses to use a procurement route which is common to large parts of the world, like PPP, then the world which is familiar with PPP and have teams that specifically travel around the world trying to do PPPs will come here. So it requires the public sector of New Zealand to travel less, as long as they advertise their projects well, and the ideas will come here. And then in the furnace of competition, the good ideas will be adopted, the poor ideas will be cast aside, and the provision of infrastructure in New Zealand will be enhanced and better. And I'm over-answering, aren't I? So the provision of the PPP infrastructure is better, but actually because the people doing the work of delivering the PPPs are New Zealanders, actually every other piece of infrastructure that's delivered in New Zealand, which isn't a PPP, benefits from the knowledge that was brought here by that South American business, that North American business, that Southeast Asian business, that Chinese business, that European business, and it's all here, and it can be used again and again and again.
Stephen, I clearly made a mistake not seating you next to me, so I could tap you when your time was up. Hey, look, no, thank you, Steve. Other Steve or Stephen. I was delighted. Your discussion on financing versus funding. I think we so often find our clients, our government are confused by those two factors. So for you to explain so clearly those distinctions. I guess it continues to amaze me how hard it is for people to see those differences. And I guess I just would ask you the question, what do you think we can do to embed that lesson? You know, we've all tried giving that sort of conversation to all sorts of people, but how do we get that message across to people to truly understand the difference between financing and funding?
I think there are two ways, and I'd give two answers. The first answer is a little facetious, but speak really slowly. And when I say that, it's repeat, 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 and demonstrate what you're talking about, because the problem is not the people in this room. The problem is the people in that room out there and that room out there who don't get it. And if something is a bad idea, beat it to death quickly. Don't keep trying to make something that doesn't work. We will all know, everybody can tell when it's a good project and tell when it's a bad project. And if you get stuck, you say, oh, no, give it to somebody who's really stupid and they'll do it. And I think we go back and forth on this so often. It is repeat, it is say it slowly, it is say it simply, but it's not this group we need to talk to. Like, we're talking to the choir here. That's not who we need to talk to. We need to talk to the people who are beyond the sound of our voices. And I think it is a bit missionary. You've got to go out and actually talk to people. If you can get there, I think you've achieved an incredible amount. And then you have to start at the next election and say the same thing all over again.
Not easy then.
Repetition matters. And it sounds horrible, but it works.
So Steve, I'd like to stay with you, but also bring Raynor in. So you talked a little bit about TIFs earlier. We had Peter talking a little bit about, well, in fact, we had our chap in Dundee talking a wee bit about Scottish version of TIFs. You've also got your MUDs in America, the municipal utility districts. I just wonder whether you, from your time here in New Zealand and from talking to your colleagues here, how applicable and how scalable into New Zealand you think those funding models might be, and perhaps Raynor, I know you're very familiar with those models, so I'd be really interested in your views on how applicable they could be in New Zealand and how to. But maybe start with you, Steve.
So you made my point from the other question, because we talked about funding and financing. TIFs are a financing issue.
Are in America.
Yeah, in America they are fundamentally a financing issue. I think the concepts are applicable everywhere. Back to my earlier comments about where you extract the value close to where the benefits are makes perfect sense. So I think yes, at the project level and at the program level, absolutely. What I would say is in my travels around the world, what happens is somebody tries to take something that responds to a unique set of contextual circumstances and then apply it, holus bolus, in another jurisdiction without being able to translate across. The skill is in the translation across jurisdictions. That's what will make these things work. And I see no reason both concepts couldn't be applicable in New Zealand.
Yeah, I guess, there's already talk, obviously, around targeted rates and sort of ring-fenced infrastructure, and certainly in Auckland it's been talked about. I guess I do have some concerns as to the applicability of very ring-fenced financing through, a TIF or a MUD or one of those structures in that setting, just from the perspective of we already have a very complex local government system. We have very diverse services that are applied. And when you start to further fragment that with, these sort of smaller municipalities, it can, we really need to simplify things and not continue to overcomplicate. But I do agree. I think there will be structures to finance, housing infrastructure through, some form of targeted rate in certain areas, and that's, it's got to happen. But I mean, you were talking earlier, and I think the key thing we really need to do is to start to attach the revenue streams to our assets, and that's probably the first point. And then once we can start to extract those revenue streams, I think from there we may find it a bit easier, and whether or not a TIF or a MUD is needed, yeah, we'll see. But
good. Okay, thank you guys. I'm going to come back to you, Hugh, and I'm going to ask you to get out your crystal ball. So with the benefit of having been involved in all of the PPPs so far, and we've had a pretty good run over the last few years, what do you think will be the next evolution of PPPs in New Zealand? What's going to come next?
Well, I think it's pretty topical, Grant. I think a lot of people in this room are thinking about that very question right now, and I'm pretty optimistic, to be honest. I think the infrastructure delivery need is going to remain. There are projects in flight, and I'm not going to talk about any particular projects, but the reality is these public assets need to be delivered, and I would see PPPs as actually being a non-political procurement tool, which is a sensible part of a procurement toolkit used worldwide by governments across the spectrum. So it's not fundamentally a political football. In the early days of PPP in New Zealand, there was a lot of rhetoric coming out directly against them, but there was also, that was coming from a standpoint of this is all about the privatisation of core government services, with the exception of the Wiri Prison project, which is operating very successfully. All the PPPs in New Zealand are asset-based deals. They don't outsource any core public services. Labor have come out in support of using transport PPPs in the future, and I personally believe that will continue in asset-heavy deals, being delivery of an asset with an AM/FM contract attached. I don't think there would be any wholesale movement away from that, and I don't think that would be counter to the incoming government's policies.
Very good, Hugh. That sounds almost like a political briefing. I'm impressed. So now to the two Stephens. What I'd like to ask you guys is, so we just had the Scottish Futures Trust presentation. You're obviously from Canada. You're very familiar with all the delivery agency model, the partnerships, BC, etc. Stephen, you'll be familiar with all the state, each of the state PPP delivery teams, major project teams in each of the states in Australia. To what extent do you each believe that a specialist agency of some form is a major and important catalyst to being able to deliver a pipeline that can attract private financing? And I'll start with our international visitor.
So when we created Partnerships British Columbia, I remember writing the cabinet documents, and we actually had three things. We said we wanted a center of competence. We wanted a vehicle to promote this as an option, and we wanted to make sure that the pipeline we created was actually an investable pipeline. And it was three things, because what in past we had discovered was there were good projects, there'd be three good projects, and then two dogs, and then something that looked like a dog but actually was a lot worse than a dog. And within government, we had the same sort of problem. We couldn't get, there were no unpaid opinions. So finance firmly do it public sector way. This is, we're in charge. We get to say yes and no. The line ministries were the exact opposite. We need something because finance keeps saying no. And we had to find a way where there was this lightning rod that could actually move things forward. And the weird thing in all of this was that the Minister of Finance actually was my client. And he had actually turned against his department, saying, I need a way to make this move forward. But I think those concepts are different than the third concept, which is a pipeline. So you've got the competence, you've got the internal, external credibility. The pipeline itself is a commitment by the public sector, by the government, to move forward on this over a period of time. And I think those are different concepts. Both are necessary and preconditions for success. Steve?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent answer. So that's exactly how I feel as well. Especially in New Zealand, where people really have to travel to get here. So I think actually the first element, which has already been achieved by Belgali, well, everybody that's participated in the market, which is a standard approach, a standard documentation for the delivery of projects that look like a proper PPP. So that's good. It allows people from afar to assess the way that we're going to address the market. I agree with the consistency of approach by government, the pipeline. I think that's essential because if people are going to come here and set up businesses, set up an office, commit their scarce human capital, they need to know that those people are investing in some sort of business that has longevity. And those two things kind of can be done without this center of excellence. But as part of Morrison & Co., who are based in New Zealand, and where we have probably chased every single project in New Zealand that was or could be or might possibly be a PPP, we have bid for things which were called PPPs which weren't, or things which failed which might have been. So I'm thinking there was like a hospital in Greymouth which kind of came up as a PPP. We put an EOI in, didn't even get a thank you for the EOI. We did a similar thing in Tauranga Hospital, didn't even want us. They wanted the charity which was set up by the local doctors to win it. So why they were running a process, I do not know. But this, lots of car parks where the first question that I now have when I go and meet local authority procurers is, what internal set of processes do you have to go through in order for you to award me this project? And when they can't answer that question, I don't bother answering their EOI. And that is a typical problem, and it is grounded in a lack of understanding, which a center of excellence could nip in the bud or could bolster that procurer, because they want the asset, to make sure that the thing that they want is the right thing to solve their problem, i.e. it fits that Treasury better business case model, and that they approach the procurement of the asset in the right way.
Thank you both. I'd like to just drill down a little bit, and it picks up one of the questions from Slido, which is, specialist agency or not, whereabout in the world, and again, I'll ask the two Stephens because you both got your international experience, where have you seen the best marketing, if you like, of a pipeline? Where have you seen really good practice of showing the market what's coming, and then what benefits have you seen from that? I'll reverse the order. Proctor, you can start this time.
I don't know. Oh, can I say there's another thing as well, actually, about those? Oh, okay, I'll answer your question. I think Australia is really good at, Australia are actually really good at innovation. So actually infrastructure, and Australian infrastructure is great. But I have got a really long list of close to market Australian projects, and kind of far away from market projects, and I have a good idea about how those projects are going to develop, and I think that is really good. And isn't it great that Australia are really close to us? So really easy to take a learning away from that market.
I think let me cover 4 markets, each with a different theme. It's past now, but Ireland, when it went on its national roads program, got the attention of the world. And I can remember, because we were on the Irish government side, and I can remember having a Spanish contractor come to me and say, but all of the domestic contractors say you have to have an Irish contractor on your team or you won't win. And I can tell you the credibility went up, our credibility went up, because of course not. Well, when the first 3 were won by Spanish contractors, our credibility went way up. But 10 roads, 10 big projects, important projects, they told the world, and they stuck to what they were going to do, and they did it. They consistent market. Australia, absolutely. The Canadians have done a better job of late than they have in the past. The other group that I think is worthy to talk about, both in a positive and a negative sense, is the UK. The UK talks a lot about pipeline, but they speak domestically, not internationally. And that's a limiting factor. When you look at some of the prices they achieve, it's a domestically focused market. And I think from that perspective, the lessons that New Zealand could learn are primarily in the past from Ireland and then from Australia and Canada.
Can I have a little follow-on as well?
A very short one, Steve.
Internally, NZTA in New Zealand have been really excellent at understanding that just because they've got a project doesn't necessarily mean that everyone's going to come, and they get most value out of having a lot of people interested in their projects. So they go out and they sell their project to the world. So they'll go travel and they will say, please come and bid on our project. And when you've got the procuring entity out there asking you to come, how flattering, yeah? But of course it's self-serving, because if people come, they get a better outcome. So they've got it, that's great procurement. They go out there and they welcome in the innovation. Fabulous.
Thank you, Stephen. And this isn't just directed at you, but we're going to try and move into a little quick fire round. I want to try and get through a number of these questions that are top of the pops on this little list that's buzzing in my hand. So I'd quite like everybody who's got a view to give an opinion, but keep it really nice and quick. So, do you think New Zealand needs to be more outcome focused in seeking private financing for infrastructure? Question, Hugh, you go first.
To be honest, I think we're already at the pointy end of it. Our PPP model has overtly started from an outcome-focused strategy. I think the social housing reform program also did. It had legislative objectives that it was trying to meet. So I would say that we are pretty much up there, and to get beyond where we are into further levels of outcome is risking going out into the stratosphere of vagueness where you simply can't measure what you're delivering.
Yeah, no, I agree with that wholeheartedly. And, if anything, we've sort of exported the outcome model slightly to Australia. So it's there. People understand it. I think it potentially, to begin with, the pricing wasn't necessarily correct on some of those transactions, but lately people are starting to be able to price that outcome risk better. So to Hugh's point, you start going stratospheric and you're going to get quite strange outcomes in pricing.
I think it's a good thing for me as an investor in New Zealand, for New Zealand projects to be exotically outcome-based, but it's because I'm here, and as a consequence, I will wrestle with that and I will deal with it. But I think it will put off many international players, which has to be bad when you're trying to build a competitive market.
Do you have a dissenting view, or do you?
I'm going to agree so that we can
move on.
hear more bells.
Does the panel have a preference for bespoke PPPs, e.g. a motorway, versus PPPs for bundles of assets, such as the schools, in a New Zealand context? Proctor, you go to fund them.
I think bundles of assets is the way to go. I think the hub model is a fabulous innovation for a small country like Scotland, and I think it's a great thing to learn from.
Hugh?
And it's working for you on schools.
Only thing I'd add is I think there's a very clear scale issue in New Zealand. Schools aren't worth doing by themselves. They need to be bundled, and you're not going to get the critical mass to bundle state highway projects over here. So I think we've got the setting about right.
Raynor, what do you think?
Yeah, look, I agree. I think bundling works. Maybe, in terms of roading, we can have sort of extensions onto that. I think, Pūhoi to Warkworth, we definitely want to see the next phase of that come to market quite quickly. So,
I would only add, as long as the bundle is similar enough. You're bundling to get scale, but it's got to be similar enough to make a difference so that you can actually create the economies of scale. And on the big projects, bespoke is just fine as long as it's big enough.
So my final question, because I'm definitely getting the look to go, is that all of our agencies are terribly hamstrung for funding. What would be the one, if you could each pick one new funding source, what would that be? What would you have government allow all of our agencies to do? Steve, you can go first.
User pay.
I'd probably re-regulate the local government sector to allow broader sources of funding to be obtained by councils and to potentially free up room on their balance sheets.
Yeah, I was just going to focus on local government. I think recycling of assets, and Stephen summed it up earlier around sort of value capture in that regard, but certainly the water system generally needs to be looked at and outside of local government ownership potentially.
I agree with that.
The asset recycling, yeah, okay. Hey, look, so thank you very much, Stephen, Raynor, Hugh, Steve, thank you very much indeed.